We call that combining elephants and unicorns. The emerging startups that are disrupting and the elephants that have the wisdom and the networks to help.
Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
This is an episode of the Ventures in Industrial IoT series, brought to you by GE Ventures. In the series, we explore success factors and challenges in industrial IoT markets with CEOs, investors, and experts. Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm joined today by Ravi Belani, Managing Partner at Alchemist Accelerator. Ravi is also faculty of entrepreneurship at Stanford University and an advisor and investor to quite a few interesting startups in the industrial space. Alchemist, from my understanding, is a venture capital firm that focuses on founders whose revenue comes from enterprises. Ravi, before we kick off into our main topic today, which is going to be looking at how you work with the companies in your portfolio and with corporates to develop the competence of these startups through collaboration, let's kick off with a quick overview of who you are, where you're coming from, and what Alchemist Accelerator focuses on. But thank you first for joining us. Really appreciate your time today.
Happy to, Eric. It's an honor to be here. We love people that are as enthusiastic about the industrial side as we are, because we oftentimes are like the unsexy accelerator doing all the enterprise and industrial companies. And so we're very happy to be a part of anybody who's part of that ecosystem. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Let me give you a bit of background so you guys know where I'm coming from. So as Eric mentioned, I have two hats. One is that I have an academic hat where I teach in the engineering school at Stanford entrepreneurship. And then I also run Alchemist. And Alchemist is different than other groups in a few ways, one of which is that we got started by the VCs. So our original investors are the venture capital funds here in Silicon Valley, like Khosla Ventures, DFJ, Mayfield Foundation, USVP, and so forth. And we only do enterprise. So we accelerate companies that are all enterprise focused. And within Alchemist, we have about 11 corporates that have joined the VCs to create the program as well, including GE, Cisco, Siemens, Johnson Controls, Analog Devices, Salesforce, and a whole bunch of others. But especially the first few that I mentioned, GE, Siemens, Cisco, and others, Juniper as well, have also funded an industrial IoT program within Alchemist. So not only are we a VC-backed accelerator, we focus on industrial and enterprise. And within that, we have a special also industrial IoT program. So we now have 250 companies that are all in these unsexy industrial enterprise spaces that have gone through Alchemist or are in the process of going through right now. And we feel like we're the largest organization focused now on the seed stage for enterprise and industrial startups. So that's a bit of background, and that will color a lot of my views on how corporates and startups can coexist and work together and dance. We call that combining elephants and unicorns. The emerging startups that are disrupting and the elephants that have the wisdom and the networks to help. And just to make it clear, what we do is we run a 6-month program. We give the companies a little bit of cash, literally like $40,000 to pay for rent during the program. And then all their other needs are generally met. And really the focus is on intense development during that time as a structured path towards fundraising, towards product development, towards mentorship, and towards sales. So all that is part of Alchemist. So that's a quick overview, and I'm happy to go. I can go into a lot more detail into a lot of different things there. So, but I'll turn it over to you from here.
Yeah, I love the focus. It's really the hidden part of the iceberg, right? The industrial side, where a lot of the most interesting stuff is happening. It's where you really have to go deep into the tech. Companies are willing to fund really cutting edge tech in a lot of areas, but it doesn't get the social media exposure. So I would suppose 99% of people out there are just not aware of what these companies are doing. So I think you're in a really interesting space. I love being in the space.
And it's exactly right. People don't know about it, but there is a lot of interest in doing things that are unique and different. So there's a lot of these third parties that rate these programs, these accelerators, and Alchemist generally gets the top designation. But CV Insights, which is another third-party analyst group, they rated the accelerators last year based on the amount of capital that the graduates raised. And Alchemist was number 1 on the list. Y Combinator, which is another prominent accelerator, was number 2. And Techstars was number 3. And everybody was surprised. They were like, oh, the surprise accelerator topped the list of best accelerators. And it's because all the companies are not consumer facing. They're all these industrial enterprise facing companies. And it's because there's a lot of capital to support companies that are actually building real businesses. So please, if you're doing anything in the industrial enterprise space, know that enterprise is sexy. And it's very gratifying work actually to be building things that create real impact and real change.
There's a thousand things that we could discuss, but for the point of focus, we're going to look at two things. One is how you're helping companies accelerate product development. Second is how companies in your portfolio are building networks of strategic alliances and using those to fill competence gaps and get out to market successfully. Let's look at the first. So you've got a great network of corporates that are already invested in the program. I'm sure you're also working with dozens, maybe hundreds of other companies that are not necessarily strategic partners, but you're engaging with. On the product development side, walk us through a little bit. When a company comes into a new batch, how do you start to get them engaged so that they're tapping your network to advise their R&D, to identify potential new use cases, pain points that should be addressing, et cetera, on the product development side?
So what we like to talk about when you're starting a company, the analogy that we like to use is it's almost like being the pilot of a plane where you have a limited runway to take off. And most ideas aren't going to die because the ideas are bad. It's rare that you have a company that is where you have a bad idea. Most ideas are good ideas. But the problem is that you have a limited runway, which is time and cash, to actually have the company become a standalone concern. And if you get to the end of the runway and you don't have the customers lined up and the product detailed out, or you don't have the cash from a funding source, you won't be able to take off. And really, the main point of Alchemist is to be maniacally focused on go-to-market and fundraising so that we make sure that you take off. Our corporate partners get involved very early. So we now have this network that we expose to the founders, which has literally 14,000 people in it that are across the enterprise space that the founders can get full access to set meetings up with different people that they need. But the real value happens in curated connections where all of the founders in Alchemist are technical. They're all working on interesting innovations, but some of them don't know who. The biggest thing that kills startups is long sales cycles, is issues, especially in the enterprise or industrial space, where big corporates will not move quick enough, and you'll kill a startup in that way because you can drain a ton of resources from the startup team unknowingly, and the startup doesn't have any points on the board to gain the traction, to get fundraising, to get talent, to get further customers. So we serve as the bridge between those two worlds. Really, there's a traditional impedance mismatch between corporates and startups, where corporates are looking for innovation, but they don't know how to work with startups and vice versa. And the way that works is that in the program, in the first 3 weeks, we are doing facilitated introductions with many of our corporate partners to startups that we think are relevant based on mutual agreement, where the startups want to meet with those partners and the partners want to meet with the startups. Then a handful of startups will be invited in for further discussion with our corporate partners to work together more closely strategically and from a product development perspective. And so for the startups, what we're doing is we're trying to expose them to a lot of people and a lot of high power people quicker, rather than going through cold introductions or frankly going up the totem pole. They're getting directly connected into the decision makers or to the leaders in these organizations. And for the corporates, in exchange for getting insight into the smartest founders that are building the coolest tech, we want them to accelerate their product development, their product onboarding process. So with the corporates, they're getting privileged access to the startups that are coming out of the ecosystem. And then in addition, they're being asked to share insights with everybody else who are the other corporate partners that are in the program, and also to do some procurement events so that they can be contributing back to the ecosystem. So they feel some encouragement, if not pressure, to not waste the startups' times and to invest and to dedicate their own resources to help the startups. Let me give you an example to make this more real. So we had 3 alums from the University of Toronto, which is a phenomenal university. It's one of Canada's top schools. And these were 2 engineering alums, 2 computer scientists, and 1 awesome business executioner, which is what we love. That's a classic Alchemist team where you have a duo technical team flanking a business executioner. And they were building a blockchain company. And these guys were awesome technologists. They'd actually mined their own cryptocurrency. They'd build their own blockchain markets in the past. But they're applying blockchain against the enterprise space. And they're phenomenally talented on their own, but they benefited from having a little bit of direction. So they actually got connected to GE in the 3rd week of the program. And GE simultaneously, we knew, was looking for a blockchain platform to address an issue on their supply chain, which was looking for help. And it was a core issue for GE. It wasn't This isn't sort of a random project. It's one of actually only 4 high priority projects that they're looking for this year. And so GE was able to share the requirements that would be needed to build a truly robust supply chain solution to this startup. It's called Authenticity in Alchemist. So GE was getting privileged access to being literally the first corporate partner that Authenticity was going to focus all their attention on. And Authenticity was benefiting from getting huge insights in terms of how to build a robust supply chain platform from arguably one of the top 10 companies in the world in terms of understanding supply chain and having supply chain partners. So that was a huge win-win. And it was much more profound than just technology scouting. So the easy thing is to say, hey, we're looking for this product, and hey, here's a startup that has a product that can address that need. And that's the first direction of product development, is just literally brokering connections, which can be very valuable. But the second order is actually influencing each other's direction, where if you get involved early enough, you can start to shape the strategy on how GE is thinking about the space. And GE can shape, obviously, the strategy for the startup. Product development is one of these bifocal exercises where you're never done. Even if you listen to Mark Benioff today, the CEO of Salesforce, he'll say that Salesforce is just 1/10 of what it's meant to be. It still has so much more to do. Okay. And when you're in enterprise and in product management, the reality is that you're never done. As a founder, you feel that acutely. You feel embarrassed. You say, our technology is not good enough to be enterprise ready. Well, the reality is that the product is never going to be fully there. There's always going to be 10 times more things that you need to get done than are done today. And so product development in the enterprise is unique because it's much more about partnerships than it is about customers and vendors. It's about forming alliances where there's an alignment in the long-term bifocal vision of where you're headed, and the corporate puts faith in you that they agree with the vision and they agree with the team to be a long-term partner. And then in the short term, it's scoping out what are the top 3 to 10 must-have needs that are going to be required to get the initial deployment done within that corporate. So for the corporate, it's incredibly valuable because they're getting insights in terms of what the next generation of entrepreneurs are working on. And frankly, it's helpful to have that exercise outside of the corporate walls because the startups can iterate a lot quicker than the corporates can. They have less to lose, and they can iterate literally in a week. They can do a rev on the whole platform. And that's just a huge asset for any corporate. And for the startup, getting GE as an endorsed customer and partner is life-changing. That alone will close checks from the VCs on Sand Hill Road to give you the capital to then continue to take off from that runway. And it is also more important than the VCs because it's a real customer validation. So in the enterprise and industrial ecosystem, the corporate players are a critical role. They're not a secondary role. They're a primary role in the success of any startup. And for corporate innovation, the startups are critical to ensure that corporates know how to grow because all too often internal R&D efforts fail and they're not correlated with success. So if you look at the companies that spend the most on R&D, they're not the most innovative companies. The most innovative companies in terms of big corporates are ones that actually have cultural differences. And so the startups are actually incredibly valuable to the corporates. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. Let me pause there because I know that might have been a lot. And I'm happy to talk about networks as well. But on product development, it is that bifocal exchange. It's getting alignment on the vision and then also the near-term tactical features, which is where the partnerships really flourish. And having that deep exchange early on is what's helpful. And making sure that both sides are incented to make sure that the others succeed and not screwing the other side over effectively.
Let me follow up on one tactical point of how to make this work. I was last week introducing a company called Vantic, which is based in the Valley, IoT application development platform, to a company in China, a large multinational. And they were talking around how Vantic can help them develop solutions for smart buildings. The company said, I love what you're doing. Very interesting. We want to explore it. Can you give us a POC? It'll take 1 to 2 years. Vantic said, yeah, we think we can get it done in a week. How do you reconcile these different timelines? Because obviously Vantic, as you said, they have a limited runway. They have to get projects closed. They think that they can execute very quickly and provide value. But the corporate says we have a strategic timeline. We have a bunch of internal processes. It's going to take time to make decisions. We have maybe hardware to roll out that also takes time. So you have very, very different timelines. How do you work with this when you're kind of maybe in the middle making introductions and helping to structure these relationships?
Yeah, that's the impedance mismatch. And that's why you need to have some type of circuit, which we serve the purpose of making sure that that does not happen, where the startups don't get beholden to a long sales cycle. So there's a strategic way we solve that, and then there's a tactical advice for the founders that don't have the strategic access. The strategic way that we solve that is by trying to create sub-organizations within these corporates that are focused on innovation, that are freer from the corporate constraints to move quicker and do procurement events quicker. So, with Cisco and with GE, they have actually created special groups, and Siemens as well. And we've influenced that as well on how those groups operate. And we will not work with organizations that cannot help the startups by being on a quicker time frame. And that's a deeper discussion with the corporates and making sure that the corporates understand the value that they get by changing their normal POC process for startups and treating startups differently than traditional vendors. If you don't have that, and we do that through incentives, they're incented to streamline their processes to get access to the top companies, because we tell them, if you do the streamlined process, you will get privileged access to our most promising technologies, but we only want to showcase them to corporates that can, respect the startup's needs. If you don't have that, it's a negotiation tactic. And what you need to do is, the reason why the corporate partner is important to the startup is that it's validation of product market fit. And there's obvious value on getting the features right on the product. But the big value is from a cash conversion cycle perspective. If the startup can close a big corporate in a compellingly enough way, it can lead to a venture capitalist or a VC to invest. And a 1 to 2 year time frame kills a startup if they have to wait for 1 to 2 years to have validation that that procurement is real. They can get over that 1 to 2 year time frame if they have an investor who can provide the cash that that procurement would have normally provided. So what we recommend, and this is a much longer conversation, is it on how you negotiate the sales process. So what we would normally want the founders to do is to say, look, we're fine with a 2 year engagement, but we're trying to choose 3 partners right now to focus on right now, because we have limited resources and we want to focus those resources on over delivering. So we need to choose 3 partners, and I want to make you one of those partners, but I need to make the case for you, Mr. Corporate, to our internal committee. And what we'd like to do is tranche out these 2 years into a few phases where we're mitigating key risks, so that by the time we get to the end of those 2 years, all the needs that you have been mitigated. But can we work through and detail out what are the key risks that you need to get done over the next 2 years? And then if they say, we first need to do a security audit, we need to do a technology validation phase, then we need to do a scaling validation. You want to then take those and tranche those into different phases of deployment. So let's say the biggest risk right now is, we need to validate the technology and I need to get these 3 guys on it. You want to scope that out to like a 12-month engagement to get that scoped out. And instead of calling it a pilot, call it technology mitigation, risk mitigation phase 1. And so there's a finer art around this, but the ideal outcome is something where you get an engagement where the corporate partner doesn't need to make any huge commitments until the end of that 1 to 2 year period, but they're going to make a commitment for an initial phase of, let's say, make 12 weeks to de-risk one element of that bigger 2 year frame. And at the end of each of those phases, the corporate partner can pull out and say, hey, I don't want to go any further. But assuming that phase goes well, then you go on to the second phase and so forth, and get at least that 2 year plan fleshed out, and ideally some commitment against that first phase. Like it might be $25,000, even though if this all closes, it's going to be $1 million deal. If you can get the corporate partner then to sign off on that plan, where they're not even committing the $2 million, but they're saying if everything goes well, then this will become $1 million or $2 million commitment at the end of 2 years. They don't have to pay any of that money until the end of that time, and they're remitting just a little bit of money up front. You can call that a booking. And it's not that you need to commit all the money from the corporate partner up front. What's critical is that you can represent to the VC that instead of saying that you're doing instead of doing a pilot, you can call that a booking, where you're doing your pilot's really the phase 1 thing, but you don't want to call it a pilot. You want to call it phase 1 deployment of this longer contract. The key thing here is that you need to have some engagement where you can then show the venture capitalist that you have a legitimate booking with a corporate partner, And that VC is going to call up the corporate partner, and the VC doesn't need you to be paid right now as much as they need to understand that this engagement will be a 7-figure or a 6-figure deal. So that becomes a little bit more tactical on how you need to manage the language that the corporate partner uses for an engagement with what's going to be required to convert to a fundraising event for you. And then ideally, it's really about not doing pilots, but doing the first phase of a 5-phase partnership and getting that first phase, getting some modest payment against that, but being able to represent to the VC that this is a certain size deal. Then hopefully, if you get 2 or 3 of those, even though it's going to take 2 years, you can raise $1.5 million at least to bridge you until that time period lasts. Ideally, you get the deal closed without it taking 2 years. And then those are other hacks, because really, usually to get it closed quicker, you need to get access to power. You need to get access to an executive at the corporation who makes it a mandate to go forward quicker.
Let's switch to the next topic now, which is building strategic alliances. I think this is very much connected. It's how do you actually get to the stage of being able to accelerate product development through these partnerships? Well, first you need the partnerships. I tell companies often that ecosystems are as important as technology in terms of establishing leadership. You see a lot of the companies that are successful out there don't necessarily have best of breed technology. There are people that have maybe a stronger in particular areas, but they're successful because they're able to fit themselves into other people's solutions. They're able to get to market successfully. I don't know if this is true. This is my impression. What is your perspective on the importance of an ecosystem? And maybe we can look at it, through the different aspects of a business. Where is an ecosystem most important in terms of R&D, product development, go to market, et cetera?
I think it's very true. It's unfortunately sort of a truism in enterprise startups that the best companies that succeed the most have the worst tech sometimes, which is unfortunate. So if you look at the darling enterprise, software, I don't want to mention names, but the enterprise software companies of old, generally they have these amazing sales teams, but the products themselves are woefully and strikingly not great. So I think it is a typical thing, unfortunately, and so this thing about networks is a very important one because, and I'm going to get to the answer in a second, but let me just give a little bit of background. Is that as for most technical founders, when you're starting out, what you need to understand is that the how you sell and the networks that you're involved with is as important as your product in determining how much you're going to get for your product. So, there's a bunch of examples of this, both traditional enterprise software, but even if you look at things that are sort of consumer-facing types of companies like WebEx, that might be a good example of. If you looked at WebEx, which looks like a sort of consumer enterprise product because you're selling video conferencing technology to users, and you compare that to GoToMeeting, WebEx got people would pay on average twice as much, if not more, for WebEx than GoToMeeting. And that's purely because of how they architected their sales process and where they sat in the networks of people that they were interacting with. And so getting baked into the right networks is critical. And so when you're engineering your startups, you need to think about both engineering a product and you need to be thinking about engineering how you're selling. So you're building your product and you're also building a process of how you're selling. With WebEx versus GoToMeeting, the fact that they were able to sell so much more and get such higher margins had nothing to do with the product. Not to offend Cisco, who's one of our backers, but the product itself, unfortunately, was not a correlation with their success. What they did do was they had a phenomenal sales process, and they aligned themselves with the right networks. In industrial IoT, this is as, if not more important than any other area within enterprise, because the stacks right now are controlled by a few key players. And if you're in bed with those players, then that also is, that will put you in a much better strategic position. Even if technologically you deserve to be there, if you're not in those networks, it can be very difficult. So getting access to those networks, for better or for worse, sometimes has little to do with the product. Obviously, you have to have a threshold of product functionality there, but then so much of it, just like everything else in the enterprise space, is about vision. It's about how you're going to build the product out over time and getting alignment on that vision from key partners, or frankly, just getting the endorsement of certain partners. And this is particularly relevant again for enterprise versus other areas because it takes so long for products to get built, and there's always more to be done. So even in this example where GE is working with this Alchemist company, Authenticity, for supply chain blockchain innovation, there is so much that has to still be specced out in that industry. And the reality is that there's so much more that has to be done on the product. But having that strategic partner already baked in automatically gets you a win in many ways, because it shows that you have the faith of an enduring partner that's going to be supporting you along the way. And that can actually outbeat even technical functions that another startup might have. So how do you get into these networks? There's different ways to do this, but as a startup, your great challenge is trying to compete with the big corporations. And sometimes these corporations, especially in Industrial IoT, are vertically integrated, where you have GE or Siemens or other big players like Schneider and others that own the full stack, and they're owning the sensors, they're owning all the data, and they have they're these full stack deployments. And then there are networks, and especially we're seeing some emerge in IoT. For example, we have a company called Amper, which is providing all the sensors for emergent SMB manufacturers to give them a dashboard of what's happening within their factories. And that's a much more horizontal play where there's a bunch of open platforms that are getting plugged into that. But even then, within that ecosystem, it's about distribution. How do you get access to all those different small businesses? Because having a direct sales force is unviable. So with each of these, there's different key partners that really are partners of distribution at the end of the day. They're networks where you can start to get baked into standard OEMs and standard deployments and leverage the sales cycles of some of the behemoths. There's going to be distribution partners that have access to a wider distributed network. Because these things are long-term commitments, a lot of that will have to happen through business development and engaging people where there's alignment on the vision, getting access to the right people. So accelerators can be bridges for those to the right connectors that are in charge of partnerships with the different corporations. And there can be very key strategic ways to get that to work. Right now, many of the corporates, for example, are trying to show. So one is that hopefully the best way to get this to work is based on merit. It's based on the key thing that you're solving and the need that's there. But unfortunately, oftentimes to expedite a sales cycle or expedite a partnership, the merit channel will take too long. And so sometimes that can happen if you can find a marketing angle in. For example, a lot of corporates are under pressure right now to evidence that they're doing something in IoT or that they're doing something in AI. And if you can bring up marketing points on that, you can use that as currency to drive a partnership earlier. And then also there's just a lot of corporations that are having deep discussions with other corporations, and just being in the know of what they actually care about and being available can be hugely valuable, because frankly, what they might most need is somebody that will actually be able to listen to them and fill up where they have everything specced out in terms of specifications and qualifications, and they just need to have a competent company or team that can fill the needs that they have. And so sometimes what's most valuable is not necessarily even peddling your product, but just making them aware that you exist and that you are open, especially in the early stages, towards the vision of what they're trying to get done. And if that does align with your vision, I don't want you to compromise your vision, but if that does align, then that can be a real opportunity.
What is your perspective on the alliances, consortiums? I mean, one of the hats that I'm wearing is the co-chair of the Industrial Internet Consortium Smart Factory Task Group. I've seen some smaller companies have success there, networking with larger companies, looking at how they can co-innovate and then building paths to market through this. You then have the consortiums that are more focused on specific verticals. You have Sigfox and these technical alliances that are around a specific standard or connectivity solution. Do you actively, build relationships with these? What's your perspective on the value of a startup trying to carve out a leadership or a prominent position in one of these networks?
I love consortiums as a hack for startup founders to build a network. Consortiums have their pros and cons in terms of, and we work with like IEEE and a bunch of these others on panels and helping orchestrate different events. But the big value for me for consortiums is that there's oftentimes a role that none of the big corporates want to play. A lot of it can be organizational or being on the boards of these consortiums. And so that is an opportunity for a founder to do that work that nobody wants to do and build out your Rolodex or your network through the consortium themselves. Consortiums are hit or miss, though, in terms of actually, and they can be a hit, but they can also be a miss in terms of setting the standards for industries. Sometimes they can work, but sometimes they'll take too long, and depending upon individual corporates, they'll just move on their own. But regardless of that, the big value is getting access to all the decision makers. So if you sit in one of these consortiums, they can be critical roles. At Alchemist, we've done panels and we've done different events with different consortia. For us, though, the big value is getting to the leaders within the big gorillas that are going to those consortia. And we've just been very fortunate that many of those have directly backed Alchemist. And in fact, we have even served as the role of, in the IoT space, for example, we had SAP and Cisco and Johnson Controls and Salesforce. They did an event together, and that happened through Alchemist, where they all came together as Alchemist backers. So we've been fortunate to play that connecting role a little bit just directly. But for a founder, I think consortia are a great hack. Go find it, whoever is the thought leading consortia or trade group, wherever you're at. Go and work or serve or lead a committee within that group that needs to be led, and that gives you the authority to just get direct access to the people of power.
Hey, Ravi, I think these are kind of the points I wanted to touch on. Anything else that you think is important to share in the context of this conversation?
Just know that you're a hero. For the founders that are out there, founders, you guys are heroes. You're going through the hero's journey, and you just need to stay present to win. You just need to stay involved. So one of the biggest uncertainties is timing. And just if you're present when your markets take off, then that you will win. That matters so much. So just persevere. And for the corporates, there's a lot happening in innovation. And if you guys, and everybody's welcome to reach out to us. My Stanford email is just ravib@stanford.edu, which is the easiest one to say. Or you can check out Alchemist Accelerator online and just feel free to reach out.
I think for people in your position, it's always also useful to kind of lay out, if a company wants to get engaged with you, what's the right way to approach you? Meaning, what information would you like to see in an introductory email so that you can make a decision on, how should we go forward? If a company wanted to contact you, what should they share?
Well, the best thing is just to apply. So you can apply online, and the application is directly online, and we do interviews almost every 4 weeks. So the quickest way to meet up with us is just to apply, and your application will be reviewed. Having said that, if you know somebody who's connected to Alchemist, if you know Eric, if you know anybody, and they write an endorsement into us, that will be added to your application and can help, but it's not at all required. So if you don't have a connection, and don't worry about needing to, create a warm introduction into Alchemist, just apply online, and we love finding teams that are doing unsexy or things that are in areas that nobody knows about, and that's what we exist for. So literally just apply online, and if you're time strapped, the most important thing is the team and the team's background. And then if you want to find other ways that you can connect into the Alchemist community, either you can see all of our companies on the site, and you can look for the founders and see if you're connected to any of the founders. But if not, don't worry too much about it. Just apply and we'll follow up.
Ravi, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@IoT1.com.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Ventures in Industrial IoT series. You can learn how GE Ventures goes beyond funding to support their partners in technology development and commercialization at www.geventures.com.